Thank you, Rabbi Wernick and Rabbi Freimir Bodzin, Chazan Nezor. Thank you to the whole Kihila. It's really an honor to be here at truly one of the leading conservative congregations in North America and the world. Thank you also to the Weisfeld family for sponsoring this Torah learning. So a few minutes ago, we had the pleasure and the honor of listening to Av do a very fine job chanting Shvi'i, chanting the final aliyah of this week's Parsha, Parshat Emor. And that aliyah, the seventh aliyah of Parshat Emor, Leviticus chapter 24, is a tremendously important aliyah because of what it tells us about the nature of Jewish law, the nature of what is absolutely central to the Jewish religion. In that aliyah, an event occurs, a person profanes the name of God, and the people aren't sure how to handle the situation. They know that what this person has done is a serious crime, but they're not sure what the law is as to what to do to this serious sinner, this serious criminal. And so they approach God, lifrosh lahem al pi Adonai. To get a commentary, they approach to get an explanation, to get specification, a perush, about what the law of God is in this situation. What's interesting about this is that God gave the law previously, much earlier in the Torah, in Exodus chapters 19 through 23, and again in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, we already learned what it was that God gave to Moses and the Israelites. God was already noten Torah. The giving of the Torah, the Matan Torah, has occurred already. And we might have thought, God's law is perfect, God's law is whole, it is complete, and so why would there be a need to approach God for a perush at this point in time? If God gave a perfect law, then surely everything the people needed to know was already available to them. In fact, that's not the case. The law that God gave was good, but it wasn't complete, and it wasn't perfect. And there would be new situations that called for greater specification, more information. There would be situations that called for perush. The seventh aliyah that we heard Av chant for us earlier is one of these situations. In fact, in Sefer Vayikra and Sefer B'midbar, in the books of Vayikra, the books of Leviticus and Numbers, there are 5 of these situations. If you go through all 5 of them, you see that the story in each case follows the same pattern. These are clearly related stories, related narratives that tell us that together tell us something very, very important about God's law, about the law that God graciously gave through Moses to the people of Israel at Sinai, but not only at Sinai. The other cases include another one like this that was that involves a person who was mikoshesh b'Shabbat, a person who didn't observe the laws of the Sabbath. Very similar to our case today, the people knew this was a sin, but they didn't know what the punishment for the sin was, and they needed to get just further information on an existing but seemingly incomplete law. There are 3 other situations that will show up in Sefer B'midbar, that show up in the book of the book of Numbers, and these cases are even a little bit more interesting because they go a step further. One of them is the case of people who were unable to participate in the Passover sacrifice because they were in a state of tum'ah, they were in a state of ritual impurity, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with being tameh, but they weren't allowed, when tameh, to approach the altar in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, so they weren't able to participate in the Passover ritual. They approach Moses and say, we weren't able to participate in Passover. The implication is, could there be some modification to the law that will allow us also this year to participate in this important ritual from which we were temporarily cut off? In other words, in this particular case, they approach Moses and ask Moses to approach God not merely with a shaila, which is what happens today, not merely with a question about further specification about the law. The truth is, in that case, the Pesach Sheni, the Passover case, the people want Moses to approach God with really a question, a halachic question, that's a little bit more of a suggestion. They're really implicitly saying, hey, couldn't there be a modification to the law that would allow us somehow to still do the Passover ritual, even though this year we had to miss it? I suspect that the rabbis in the congregation have probably had situations like this where somebody approaches them with a shaila that is really more of a hatza'ah, a question that implies what the answer that they're looking for is. And then there's another case that happens like that in the book of Numbers, involving the daughters of a man named Tzlofchad. Tzlofchad dies without any sons, but he has several daughters. And as a result of him not having sons, his real estate holdings are not going to be kept together in his family. Something else will happen to them, but he's got no sons to inherit his real estate. And if his real estate in the land of Israel that his family should have gotten eventually when they go into the land of Israel, if that is no longer associated with his name, in ancient Near Eastern thinking, that would affect his afterlife negatively. His daughters are concerned about the state of his afterlife, and they go to Moses and say, well, why couldn't we inherit the land? And that would keep the land associated with his name, which in ancient Near Eastern thinking means he's going to have a better afterlife. Here again, the people approach, in this case, a number of women approach God and say, not merely, we've got a question, but implicitly, and it's quite clear in the text, they're really saying, we've got a suggestion. And what's fascinating in both of these cases, the one about Passover, the one about the daughters of Tzlofchad, is that God's response is not what we might have expected. You might have expected God to say, I'm God, I'm perfect, my Torah is perfect, and who are these women to tell me how to run my universe? That's not what God says. Rather, what God says is, Kain dovrot benot Tzlofchad. The daughters of Tzlofchad are speaking correctly. They've got a good idea, and the law is now modified so that in the situation where a man has daughters but no sons, the daughters are allowed to inherit that man's real estate, that man's farm. It's a very, very interesting case about how God doesn't seem to regard God's law that God gave at Mount Sinai as automatically perfect. No, it's very good, but it could get better. And it gets better when Israelite men and Israelite women come to God with a question, including questions that are in effect a suggestion. The fifth case at the very, very end of Sefer B'Midbar, the very, very end of the book of Numbers, I think is the most interesting of all, because this is a case in which it's not merely that God's Torah given at Sinai is amended, but the amendment is amended. The daughters of Tzlofchad belong to the tribe of Menashe, so all of that real estate that they're inheriting is part of the tribal inheritance in the area of the land of Israel belonging to Menashe. And the elders of the tribe of Menashe realize, wait, if the daughters now marry a man who's not from the tribe of Menashe, then ultimately the land will go to their children, and part of the tribal inheritance of Menashe will switch to another Israelite tribe. We don't like that idea. So they want Moses to approach God with a question/suggestion, with a shaila/hatza'ah, saying, well, what about this situation where maybe our tribe will lose some land as a result of this law? And again, God doesn't respond, I already answered this question. I'm perfect, my law is perfect, the amendment that I gave to my law is perfect, so who are you to ask this sort of a question? No, God says, Kain dovrim mate Menashe. The elders of the tribe of Manasseh speak correctly, and God amends the amendment. God says, the daughters can inherit this real estate. But if they marry a man from outside of Menashe, from outside the tribe of Menashe, they have to forfeit that right. If they don't get married, or if they marry a man from within the tribe of Menashe, which is overwhelmingly what was going to happen anyway, in all likelihood, then they can exercise their right to inherit the land. The amendment gets amended. What we're learning in today's parasha and in these other 4 stories is that maybe an initial assumption we might have made about God's law is clearly not the assumption of the Torah itself. It is not the case that the law God gives to us, or the law God gave to us, is perfect. It is not the case that the law that God gave to us is perfect. It is rather the case that the law that God gives to us and continues giving us over time is perfectible. And furthermore, the process of improving a good law, of taking a good law and making it better, is driven not only by God, but primarily by us, by the Jewish people who respectfully ask questions and respectfully sometimes even give a suggestion. What we're learning, in other words, I'd like to suggest from the last aliyah of today's parsha and from 4 other narratives within the Torah is, you might phrase it this way, is when did conservative Judaism start? When do we first get a kind of Judaism in which the law is central, our obligation every day and every week to observe the law, to observe our obligations is central, but that law is not static. That law can become even better. That law is subject to tikkun. It can become more and more perfect. And we have the right as human beings, as Jews, to participate in a dialogue with God, with Moses, and with the tradition that comes out of the Torah that Moses received. We have the right and maybe the obligation to continue that process of improving and perfecting an already good law. That's how I would describe conservative Judaism, Masorti Judaism. It's about observing a law and also participating communally as a people in helping that law evolve over time. Not leaving it just to God, but we participate in that evolution of the law. When does that kind of Judaism begin? It doesn't begin in the 19th century with Zechariah Frankel or with Solomon Schechter. That kind of Judaism begins in the Torah. We see that in the 7th aliyah of today's parsha. We see this in several other passages, 4 other narratives, another number of other psukim that I'm not going to be talking about within the time frame of this Devar Torah. But we see in today's parsha and other parts of the Torah that conservative Judaism begins in the Torah itself. And I think it's worth our while to realize that sometimes and to step up to the plate and participate in this process. To realize we don't need to apologize for being the kind of Jews that we are. We don't need to say, well, this is a new kind of Judaism, but we kind of want to be committed to it anyway. No, this is not a new form of Judaism. This is a form of Judaism that goes back to the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu, that goes back to the time of Moses. And it's a kind of Judaism in which we can step up to the plate, and by observing the law, we can also participate in the process of perfecting the law. After Kiddush today, I'll be answering some questions about this, so if you've got some questions, you've got a little bit of time to formulate them, and I look forward to answering them later today. And for now, I'll just say Shabbat Shalom, Mazal Tov, and thank you to the Kahal.